thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Hugo Daniel. I'm working at the Fondation Giacometti, and I'm the curator of the Giacometti Beckett show at the Giacometti Institute. The show is currently installed, but it cannot open to the public due to the health situation in France and obviously everywhere. So tonight, we're engaging in a discussion with the artist Gerard Byrne, whom I'm very happy to have tonight. And I would like to thank you, Gerard, for being with us tonight. And since I'm introducing this presentation, I would like also to thank Cultural Ireland and the Irish Embassy in France for the support. Just briefly, as an introduction, I would remind that Gerard Byrne is a visual artist from Ireland whose visual work often develops multimedia and installation format, and it has gained him international renounce. For instance, he represented Ireland at the Venice Biennale in 2007. Gerard Byrne tonight will tell us about his interest in Beckett's productions, and more particularly in Giacometti's depiction of the set for Waiting for Godot, which he made in 1961 for Samuel Beckett. The work Gerard did on Beckett culminated in 2005 in an installation incorporating a reinterpretation of the tree created by Giacometti for Beckett. And that tree, you can see it on the background. That's the installation and background of your screen. This is the installation of the Gerard trees in front of larger photograph of the original set of Waiting for Godot from 1961 at the theater of Odeon. So tonight we'll talk about this tree, the original, and how Gerard apprehended working on Beckett's scène. So thank you, Gerard, and I'm happy to see what you have to say about this tree, and then we can go forward with a discussion about you working on this sculpture and prop. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Hello, everybody. Firstly, I should do the polite thing, and I don't know if an apology is the right word to use, but anyway, I'm sorry that I can't deliver this talk in French. But trust me, if I did try to do it in French, you would beg for mercy, and you would you would plead for me to go back to English. So so be it. My French is very rusty at this point. Anyway, so yes, so I am the Institute invited me. I've had the Foundation Giacometti I've had a relationship with them over a number of years that connects around this work that I made around which Hugo has just described. This, I guess you call it a sculpture. I think that's actually up for discussion, and that's part of the character of the work, is that it is up for discussion. But what I'll do, I think, is I'll just jump into slides, and then that'll help me to avoid speaking too abstractly. I'm going to say that I do lots of artist talks. I have ways of talking about my work. I have certain works that I tend to talk about, and other works that I actually don't really talk about very much, because maybe they're just more difficult to come to terms with in the context, in the format of a talk. Some works are easier to talk about, and some works connect in a very linear way, and you can formulate a very succinct kind of argumentation quickly. The work that, the reference point for this talk, which is the work that I have in the current exhibition in the Foundation, is one of the works I wouldn't normally talk about. And it's part of a sort of strand in my work that I don't normally talk about, to be honest. So So firstly, this is a very improvised talk. It's not polished at all. I'll try to keep it on track, and I'll try to keep it from at a speedy pace. The other thing that I should say is that in my time this afternoon assembling materials for the talk, I realized that I'd spent time with, I don't know, can you see me on the screen as well, or is it just that you just see my laptop image? Okay, anyway, I'm holding up the Giacometti Beckett book that the Institute just published, a wonderful book. And in reading that book and thinking about my own works in relation to that, I realized that I had actually a huge range of work that related to what I consider to be the central kind of thematics of the current exhibition, which are, I suppose, the current exhibition at some level. For me, the Giacometti Beckett exhibition seems to me, at least from the publication, to be obviously about Beckett and Giacometti and the correspondences between them, but also as you read through the text of the book, you realize it's highly speculative. The whole book is a speculative history, and it speculates about a long-standing relationship between these two figures that's hardly documented at all. I think there's a line in Hugo's text where he talks about that or maybe it's Christian's essay where he talks about all the published essays, the huge 4-volume publication of Beckett's letters from a couple of years ago, and how in all those letters there's not a single mention of Giacometti, despite the fact they had a 30-year kind of familial relationship around Paris. And obviously they had the point where they worked together at the Théâtre de l'Odéon. So the book is a kind of speculative history, and it's also a history about the idea of the relationship between artists, which is something that I realize is very central to my work. As you'll see, I've made a lot of work that's about other artists' work. So I'll move forward. I hope my slideshow is going to work here. Yeah, it's slightly slow. So basically, this is a photograph of the Gate Theatre in Dublin, which is a well-known theatre. It dates back to the 18th century. They became synonymous in recent decades for productions of Beckett in Dublin. Obviously, Beckett is this kind of Janus type figure. He's both French and Irish, and I guess there's claim and counterclaim, which is entertaining. But when in Ireland, we claim Beckett as our own, and even if he mostly wrote in French. So this is the set of a production of Waiting for Godot. And I made this photograph as part of a series of photographs in 2002. I realized these photographs, which I seem to have to click on them. Oh yes, sorry. These photographs, these are just a few from a series of about 7 or 8 photographs I made of this very austere set. As you can see, it's not, the stage lighting is off, it's only the house lights on. I photographed it during the afternoon. I call the photographs point of view while waiting for Godot. And the idea was, at some level, it was the beginnings of speculation about the relationship between the point of view of a camera. I mostly work with cameras, either film cameras or video cameras or still photography cameras, although occasionally I work with objects as is manifest in the current exhibition in Paris. But in this instance, I was interested in the idea of the type of subjectivity of the characters in the play. And I was interested in the idea that those subjects within the play had physical point of view, while it's a kind of a weird kind of layering of ideas, slightly metaphysical, you might say. But it was this series of photographs, which I made quite young. I mean, early in my development as an artist, I was about in my late 20s, early 30s, where the departure point, the first explicit point where I worked on a reference to Beckett or to this iconic tree. In this case, actually, the tree design has its own history. As you can see, it's very elemental. It's made of wood. The leaves on the left-hand side of the screen are actually stuck to the backdrop behind the tree, but of course, from the perspective of the auditorium, they look like they're part of the tree. And because there's one in one act, the tree has leaves, and another act, the tree doesn't have leaves. This set was designed by Louis Le Brocquet, who was a kind of Franco-Irish artist, mostly known in Ireland. I don't know how well known he was in France. Mid-late 20th century artist, a painter and a tapestry maker, great artist, and kind of late modernist. And Le Brocquet was very celebrated in Ireland. And so he had this moment where he designed this set for Waiting for Godot, and this is the set that's sort of ritually taken out every few years at the Gate Theatre for new productions of Godot. So in making these photographs, of course, it's triggered a bit of research, which is the research that ultimately led me to the Giacometti connection. And these are, sorry, they're kind of pixelated images, but I think the images will be probably familiar to many people at this point. These are a couple of photographs. There's very, very few existing photographs, but these are a couple of production photographs for the production of Godot from the Théâtre de l'Odéon in 1961, I think it is, which I stumbled across in research. I think I was researching in the New York Public Library. This has a wonderful theater archive there. And this is Beckett in profile. Sorry, the images are so pixelated. I couldn't find the higher resolution images, but I think you get the meaning of them anyway. And so, yeah, so these are photographs from I read about this production of Godot as part of I was doing I was interrogating this idea from the Gate Theatre productions, from the Le Brocquet tree. I was interrogating the idea of researching the history of artists who made props for theatre. Actually, that was explicitly what I was doing, and I was doing it because I had a specific concept in mind for an installation work of mine, which I'm going to show you now. And along the way, I came across a lot of material. This is just a photocopy of a work, a kind of a prop, a kind of a worn sculptural work by Isamu Noguchi, made for Martha Graham. You can see this is just from a book. Noguchi did a tremendous amount of work with Martha Graham in the famous American choreographer in the 50s and 60s, around the same time as we're talking about with the Beckett-Giacometti relation. And there's wonderful work that Noguchi made. I think of all the artists that I discovered, mid-20th century artists who were working with theater, Noguchi is kind of the preeminent figure. This is a head of Apollo. It's actually it's a base, as you can see, and then there's a bent steel structure above it. Actually, it's two intersecting profiles, head profiles, very abstracted, and it's very dramatically lit, as you can see, and it's from a Greek tragedy. The production is a Greek tragedy. It's from a theater in London, which I am forgetting the name of, again from the same period, and it's Barbara Hepworth is the sculptor here. And Hepworth, this is the same sculpture, the same work, which is now housed, it's in the Tate collection, and I think it's in St. Ives, and you can see it's outdoors, and it's on a pedestal, and it looks completely different to this. And in a way, that's maybe an interesting juxtaposition, because one of the things that sort of I was really interested in this research was the fact that at what point was an object a sculpture and at what point was it a prop? And how do we distinguish those things? How do we arbitrate between them or not? I think in the case of the Hepworth, as you can see here, the prop, which is what we have here, or the scenography, which is what we have here, has been claimed as a sculpture by its positioning in Tate St. Ives. And I mean, it's very poorly cited even as a sculpture, but so be it. The point is that there's this sort of transition in the meaning of the object from one situation, from its original situation, which was here, to here. And that idea of the relationship between props and sculpture became central to, now this is the final reference point I want to show. This is another Noguchi, slightly out of order, but this is a Noguchi for a production called John Brown's Gallows. It's again similar mid 60s American theater production, and again it's a gallows, like for hanging people, obviously, and it's at the same time it's freestanding, and it has this very sculptural form, and with the raincoat, and this is a hat. The circular shape is like a cowboy hat or something like that. So then I took all this material and I kind of processed it and I worked with it and I found reference points, and then I ended up making, this is the very first version of the Giacometti tree that I made. And, I'm the first to admit that my various renditions of the tree, which have ended up with the sort of final rendition, which is in the exhibition here, none of them are completely accurate. And I'm comfortable to say that, because actually, unfortunately, the Giacometti tree doesn't survive. The original doesn't survive. All that's left is these few photographs, to my knowledge. It's a while now since I sort of did this research, but around this time, I actually also contacted the theater in Paris, and I did the research, and then subsequently, just through correspondence with Christian and Hugo at the Institute in Paris, I realized that the prop that Giacometti made was disposed of after the production, which is incredible to think of, because it was a Giacometti. Giacometti was at the height of his fame at this point, and so the fact that it was disposed of just indicates somehow like a profound difference in the status of it as an object. It was clearly not recognized as a sculpture. So that became a central part of my idea. And so I had to work from these photographs to produce a kind of copy of it. And I've always, in a way, I've always called what I've made to be a prop, but it's a prop that in a way references Giacometti's prop. I don't really think it works as a sculpture. It always needs, I'm very happy with the way that it's been shown in the context of this exhibition, because it needs that context to work. It only works within that historical context, from my perspective. This is the first version of it I made for an installation in 2004 that I made in Dublin, which was called In Repertory, which is where I gathered a number of objects that had, this was a reference to a backdrop from Oklahoma, a Broadway production of the musical Oklahoma, which I fabricated. And then there's also this cart, which was Mother Courage. Obviously, it's a reference to another theater, specific theater production of the Brecht play Mother Courage. So the idea then was to assemble these objects to make a kind of theater scene in the gallery space, and then This is another version of the same work from the Lembach House in Munich from a year or two later. We had this wonderful well structure, which I can't remember. It was from a German production. But the idea was to build this mise en scène and then to film people in there and then to produce a kind of a film out of this. And I think at some point, this is another image of the tree. And this is another image of in repertory. This is from an exhibition in the US Museum in Bard College. And you can see in the foreground is a copy of it's a very dark image because of the lighting, but in the foreground is the Hepworth Apollo head, and to the left in the background is the Giacometti tree, and to the right in the background is the Gallows by Noguchi. And the lighting, you know, varied, and it was all theater lighting, but it was a gallery space, and the objects just sort of stood there. And then I think we're going to have a video now, if I can get it to play. Sorry, maybe I need to give it a minute to start. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't playing. I'm just going to exit. Oh, sorry, it's the wrong video. I'm just basically flicking through now. Here's another manifestation of the tree in a completely different exhibition context. And here is the Gallows in a different context. Sorry, I've lost one of my videos. I'm going to cut out of this for a second and just grab it. No, that's the wrong video. Here it is. Okay. So this is just a very simple, small section of video that documents people in this mise en scène, in this installation in Paris. You can see the lighting changes. This is a production in the presentation of In Repertory in the US. And the focus actually was really on the idea that the audience became characters within the mise en scène, and that the whole thing was only really assembled as a mise en scène in the camera. So when you were in the space, you had this weird kind of ambivalence about whether you were there looking at sculptures or props, and people, as you can see, there was a I think when people saw the camera, there was a kind of level of interaction and obviously in terms of the way this material was edited by the museum, there's a kind of focus on people interacting with work. I also did a version of this installation in the Biennale de Lyon in 2007. Maybe somebody in the audience saw that. But there's very much the idea that the mise en scène only comes into being in the video documentation of the work, rather than something that comes into being in the exhibition space. And I think the one thing I want to talk about, maybe finally about this, is just the idea of the title, In Repertory. I'm sure there's a French equivalent, but In Repertory is a standard term in theatre, in English language theatre anyway, to describe the canon of plays, of which Waiting for Godot would be one, and the Greek tragedies would be others, that form a canon, and they become something that actually can be performed, not new, but can be taken off the shelf and performed at different points. I'm going to go back now. And so I was interested in this idea of being in repertory. It's as a kind of almost like a heavenly kind of limbo, a kind of space in between. Um, and as I said, I was interested in also in the idea of the idea of the legacies of Beckett and or the legacies of working with theatre references and working with the relationship, pushing ideas around the relationship between art and theatre. I'm just going to show something now, which is, I'm going to show a small section of a video work that I made called He Searches for, well, it's shortened to He Searches, but he searches for the opposite of saved, which is a quote from Beckett. And it's a video work. C'est jubilatoire. Toute forme de décalage est jubilatoire. So while this is playing, I'm just going to take a moment to take a breath and just say, this is actually a theater company, I think from Marseille. I can't remember their name, unfortunately, which is bad. But I basically filmed a dress rehearsal of a production of Godot that they staged in Ireland. And I'll turn down the sound. And I had all this material, and I was trying to figure out, what can you do with the material, just straight. And even though it was beautiful material, and then I came up with this, just ideas around editing and disruption, and this idea of like this sort of shivering staccato kind of interruption of the performance. And it's not a big work. It's a work I've shown quite infrequently, and I've used it in very strange ways in exhibition contexts. It's almost like an in-between work. But it's one of, I made so many works about Waiting for Godot in particular. I realized I had to skip through most of them here today, but I think what's important, I think the point I wanted to really kind of press home is that for me, for me, I'm interested in. Let me turn down the sound on that completely. I'm interested in the idea of art and theater. I always have been. I'm also interested in the idea of the concrete historical relationship between the work that I make and the work that the historical reference points that I'm interested in. And so that's why, like, in a way, when I looked over the Giacometti Beckett book, I really thought about this activity that the historians and the curators were endeavoring to do in the book, which is to kind of speculate on the concrete history in the absence of documentary evidence between Beckett and Giacometti. And for me, like, all this work is available. Like, Giacometti's work is available and relevant to where I'm at, as is Beckett and or Hepworth or whatever. And I've often made work that seems to confront the reality of these other works. So I'm going to skip forward in this now and show something else. This is a work, for example.
I wanted to loosen myself.
Sorry. I'm going to go back to the beginning of that. I'm just going to say, I'm going to show a different work now called A Thing Is a Whole and a Thing It Is Not, from about 2011, which is a very elaborate, like, huge kind of 5-channel video installation that I made about minimalism. And in some ways, it's an important reference point for this talk, because, as I said, in a way, what's thematic throughout even the material I've shown so far is the idea of making work that at some level is kind of about the history of sculpture in the 20th century, whether it's Hepworth or Giacometti or Noguchi, or a later reference point I have to Brancusi. But this work is about minimalism, and all of that connects back to, I don't know how familiar people are with the famous essay by the American art historian Michael Fried called Art and Objecthood. And that text talks about the relationship between sculpture and theater. And in particular, he calls minimalist art, which is best known in America as being American art, as a type of theater. In other words, he's equating minimalist sculptures with something that's akin to the prop. And he would never say that about Hepworth or Giacometti or Noguchi, but he says that about, which is kind of ironic given the material that I've just shown you, but he says that about minimalism. And so I made a project with the Van Abbe Museum in the Netherlands, which has a significant connection of minimalist work from the 60s, actually from around the same time as the Giacometti tree. It's all early 60s material, even though it looks completely different and looks like it's from a different historical period to the Giacometti. And so this is also important for me. And so I made a series of films we basically installed all these, their minimalism collection in the old wing of the Van Abbe Museum, and I filmed the whole series of mise-en-scènes there, probably 30 different mise-en-scènes. I'm just going to show you one or two here now.
I wanted to loosen myself from European art, the traditional painting and sculptural art. It is finished, and I know precisely what I have thought about it. But what I'm thinking about now is much more difficult to explain, much more complicated. It's extremely difficult for Danjad, 41, to describe his work and the system which he uses to bring his work to realization. After he studied philosophy and art history, Judd became an art critic, and he started making paintings. His paintings led nowhere. When he realized that, Judd tried to break away from what he calls traditional European art.
And the next one. The painting here is from 1967. It's by Frank Stella. It's called Effingham 2, I think. And basically this work was shot, I mean, not every scene had this cameraman in it, but the work in a way was about the relationship between the objects and how they're viewed, and about the idea. I read this fascinating essay about how the minimalist artists were very, very insecure about how their works were photographed. And so, you know, they were actually uncomfortable with having their work. A lot of them, like Carl Andre, were very uncomfortable with having their work documented, because they felt that in a way it dramatized the work. You know, the mise en scène of the photographic image itself was a type of dramatization. So that's it. I think that chimes with some of the ideas that I've been talking about. You know, maybe I'm aware I'm just going to finish now in a minute, but I'm just going to see what other material I have. I've shown that. Sorry, just exit here for a second. Just I want to get one more piece. Unfortunately, a lot of my videos begin with black frames, which makes them very difficult to negotiate in this context. This I'll probably skip through, but this is from an older work from 2007, 2008, which was a film I made, again, a very long film about...
Though the possibility of encountering intelligent...
I'm just going to mute it here for a second. A very long film called 1984 and Beyond, which was about... which was basically a reenactment of a very long roundtable discussion published in 1963, again from this same period. And the discussion was published in Playboy magazine, and it was a discussion between a lot of very important science fiction writers of the time, in which they discussed what the world would be like in 1984. And I broke it into multiple chapters. And this one, the reason why I wanted to show this one was because I filmed several scenes in a sculpture pavilion, the sculpture pavilion built for the Sonsbeck exhibition, again from the same period. And it was built to house a Hepworth exhibition, which actually just remained in place. And so, it's all housed in the grounds of the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, which has a wonderful sculpture park you're probably familiar with. And this pavilion was designed by Gerd Rietveld, the Gerd Rietveld, and it was originally designed to house these sculptures on a temporary basis, but it was left in permanent situation. And that's something that quite interests me, the idea of something that was built in a temporary way and that it sort of still exists today, even though that wasn't the intention. So I'll just play a little bit of this, and I'll let you listen to the sound, and then maybe we'll stop at that.
All these social scientists will be brought down to Washington with top secret stamped on their foreheads. And then, since they won't know too much about these aliens either, the governments will dig up some grubby old science fiction writers and ask them, how strange can these characters be? And at that point, we will run through the multitudinous permutations that science fiction writers have presented, and we will suggest, well, whether they are collectivists or individualists isn't nearly as important as whether they are asexual, bisexual, transsexual, or products of precision manufacture.
Any condition in chemistry, whether it is within our present scope or not, which allows the building of large molecules, provides a situation in which life can exist. and inevitably will,
Well,
I think.
I operate on two adages. The first is Sturgeon's law, which says nothing is always absolutely so, and the other adage states nature tries everything. And I go further, nature tries everything everywhere, and modify that to nature tries everything everywhere where it's possible.
Yes, but let's modify that just a little further down too. Nature tries everything that the laws of physics permit, which in turn will include just about everything we can imagine.
Well, I think the laws of physics may subsume things we can't imagine.
Well, that's a chilling thought. When you think of the things we've been able to imagine, Bob Heinlein's Titans, for example, in the Puppet Masters. Intelligent slugs who could fasten up your back and thereafter control your thoughts and actions. Or Hal Clement's creature in Needle, which could ooze into your tissues and live there. And Stanley Weinbaum's Silicon Beast in the Martian Odyssey. A creature which absorbed sand, grain by grain, slowly extracting what it needed, and every year or so laid a brick and moved on a few inches. Well, I don't doubt one moment that nature can out-imagine these trifles.
Writers like Jack Williamson, Fred Hoyle and Olaf Stapledon have suggested that stars and nebulae might themselves be forms of life.
Well, we are certainly going to run into life as we don't know it, but we may even have run into it 8,000 or 30,000 years ago. And as Dr. Asimov suggests, not recognized it as alive. We may be living with it at this moment and not know it. The obvious point being, you can't know what you don't know. Maybe it's totally neutral towards us and therefore doesn't have to be accounted for. Maybe the Rocky Mountains are alive on some extremely long time scale. Maybe the Earth is inhabited by some life form so unlike ourselves that we don't recognize it as anything but a rock, a tree, or a cloud. And so we formulate laws of physics to account for physical properties that are actually behavior patterns.
Well, for the sake of such creatures as yet undiscovered, I find myself hoping that they will be so unlike life as we know it that we will completely ignore them. If they...
Sorry, I'm going to mute that because I'm just going to make one or two points about this before it finishes, which I think are important to the overall discussion. So as you get the sense here. So this is the mise en scène here is this the pavilion designed by Rietveld to house the Hepworth sculptures. Again, it's I think from 1963, so it's within 2 years of the Giacometti Beckett collaboration. And I think one of the things that really struck me about this space and these Hepworth sculptures, both the pavilion itself and the Hepworth sculptures, is that it really taught me about how I really have this strong sense that mid-century, this kind of high point of modernism, we'll say, in the mid to late 50s into the 60s, there was this preoccupation with a type of primitive aesthetic, a sort of primitivist or essentialist aesthetic, which I think is very clear in Giacometti, and you can also see it in Hepworth. I mean, it's so elemental, and even in the Rietveld pavilion also, it's very elemental. This open structure with these walls that have these apertures laced throughout them. And, you know, it's such a primitive idea of shelter, basically. And it's funny that it's raining on the day, it's raining in the film. And I have this sense that really that was part of this idea, this preoccupation of that modernist moment with the idea of transcending history, of becoming ahistorical, of stepping outside the trajectory of history, so Hepworth saw herself as kind of almost a primitivist, as somebody who was ahistorical in her work. And I think there was there's something, I mean, it's risky of me to talk about Giacometti in this learned company because I'm not a great scholar of Giacometti, even though I love the work. But I would wager that there's something of a similar quality, I think, in his work. And I think as an artist of my generation, a kind of early 21st century artist, I think that idea of escaping history, that sort of mid 20th century primitivist, essentialist kind of idea that you could transcend the historical moment became a sort of fascinating impossibility. And I think that is a preoccupation, that's a thematic that's kind of run through the way that I've worked with these historical reference points. And so I think, and for me, I think the idea of the camera and the photographic image has been my tool to, in a way, move through history back and forth, to reference Giacometti from 1961, or to reference Beckett, or early minimalism, etc., etc. So maybe what I'll do is, I'm reasonably timely, even though the talk was a bit rushed, but I think I'll stop this share now. I think it's as good a time as any to kind of open for any comments. I can show more work, of course. I have so much work related to Beckett, I realized. It's embarrassing, but anyway.
Thank you very much, Gerard. And also the idea is to go on in a discussion. So this is a very good basis. And thank you very much for sharing all those videos that are not always very accessible to everyone. And so I guess as a beginning, I would like to get back to your interests in Beckett. You mentioned being interested in the very beginning by the characters by Beckett, but some aspect that I see of your work on the tree, and I just briefly mentioned it as referencing to a sculpture, but actually both Giacometti's object, let's call it that way for the moment, Giacometti's object being a prop, a sculpture, or a whole set design, and your own installation. I believe the correct word to characterize your work would be an installation, because there's not only, and we didn't mention that before, but it's not only reinterpretation, not exact, as you mentioned, a reinterpretation of the tree, but also an ensemble of light design which evokes the sunset of the scene, etc. All those elements are not related to the characters, but much more to the stage design. And I feel that there's also maybe, but you correct me and explain us if that's correct or if it's something else. But I think that the stage directions in Beckett's plays, and more specifically on the text for the Godot play, are very, very interesting, because they're very scarce, but they're very precise. And we know also that Beckett was very keen on being the most exact and maybe minimalist, not in the sense of the 60s artists, but in the least means of expression used to express the maximum. And that was his idea, and was very, very precise on the way stage directions and stage props were used. And I believe that's also something that indicates why he asked Giacometti, his friend, to do the restaging of Godot in 1961, because the first version in 1952, 53 for the first presentation of the play, did not satisfy him. So what I mean is, were you interested in the stage direction? We can remind the fabulous beginning of Godot, setting the stage in a very brief, concise way: a country road, a tree. That's all. And I believe that's very
It's country road, a tree, full stop, evening.
Evening, right? Because the light is also interesting. Could you comment on that first?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said, this is stuff. These are ideas that have been very central to my work for a long time, but I've actually never spoken about them very explicitly before. So I don't know how good a job I'll do in answering your question. But as you know, Hugo, I also made a whole series of photographs based on that exact phrase, a country road, a tree, evening, which were these speculative photographs. I traveled through parts of France and parts of Ireland that I knew, rural parts that I knew that Beckett inhabited. And I made photographs in the countryside of situations that were country roads with singular trees, like skeletal trees. And I photographed them in the evening time. I made the photographs in France were mostly made around Roussillon in the south east, where Beckett lived during the war, because in the biographies and in the literature, the speculation is that that's in a way his time there during the Second World War was somehow the time that germinated the play, the Godot play. You know, so there's a kind of a connection between that place and Godot. It's a speculative connection. He never said that explicitly, to my knowledge, but yes, I suppose what I'm interested in, the reason why I bring up the photographs without showing them, is just because I'm interested in the idea of the concrete at some level, and I'm interested in the relationship between the theater and sort of actuality, and I'm interested in this sense that so it begins with those first photographs I showed of the stage in Dublin in the Gate Theatre. And maybe even that image that showed the stage but had the house lights on in the auditorium, and so you have this weird duality of two spaces together, and there's spaces that are meant to be either one or the other. There's and I suppose I've always been interested in theater from the point of view of an artist, because I'm also interested in the idea of that it has a ritualistic quality. It has a quality like this idea of being in repertory, of something that's repeated and repeated, and it differs each time, but it still has this ritual of repetition and difference, but repetition nonetheless, which is the central principle. And I think that's one of the ideas that actually makes, for example, the prop fundamentally different to the sculpture, because the sculpture is an object that signifies its own specificity and its own distinction, right? So when you have a sculpture by, Henry Moore, you can't substitute it with something else that's like it. There is only one of them. Well, actually, Henry Moore is not the best example because he made casts, bronze editions, but I'm thinking about singular works, right? And the same applies to Giacometti, of course. But the prop is always a version. It's never an original. It's always a version, a copy somehow. So Giacometti's tree, which we mourn the loss of, was already a kind of copy. It wasn't an original in a sense. It was already made as a copy. It was a kind of facsimile that probably at some level referenced the productions of Godot that had already happened before 1961, because I know there was multiple productions before 61, not just the original one from 52 or whenever, 54 I thought it was, but multiple in between. But also it references the idea of a tree from the script. So it's already a kind of copy or something in a way that a sculpture isn't, right? And so that's why the prop has this possibility of, in a way, I realized, even though I tried to make it as accurate as I could, it was also pointless because there's no such thing as, because it's not about accuracy, actually. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that makes me think of two things. We can go further in the direction of the idea of not a copy, but an occurrence maybe of something. But because actually I think that's broader than theater prop question. It's almost how every work of art works, and if we could also you reminded one of the supposedly period of preparation for Godot, which is the time Beckett spent in the Roussillon.
Yeah.
We also know for a fact that Caspar David's Friedrich painting, Two Men Gazing at the Moon, is a precedent or an inspiration, but I think this term is not sufficient to Godot, and Godot is also is already a transfiguration in a sort of this painting from Friedrich. And so, but maybe we'll talk about this later, because this brings a lot, I think, to many aspects of your work. But what you mentioned also is how you worked on the tree, actually, and I might be interesting as beginning to know more about how you worked, how you documented it, because that's a work I had to do also for the exhibition, to track the whereabouts of the tree. It has disappeared, as many stage props, but how it was presented. How did you work? Because you mentioned the fact that the tree is not the exact tree, and this difference is very interesting, because that's where you see it's not only a reenactment, but something that interrogates the status of the tree. So could you comment on that? And first, maybe explain how you worked. What was your documentation? You mentioned the photographs, but was there something else?
No, I only had those photographs.
How did you came about them? How did you discover?
I think I saw them published somewhere, and then I did write to my assistant contacted the theater in Paris and organized to get copies of them from their archive or through them. I mean, I have to admit that at the point that I was doing this work, I actually had a French assistant, so I kind of left him to do the whole job, and he went and he did the research. He found the photographs from the Théâtre de l'Odéon, and they sent us copies, and then we had only these photographs to work from, and they're actually quite difficult photographs to work from, because the tree is so white in the way it's lit on the stage against the black background. It's very difficult to understand which branch of the tree is in front and which is behind. It becomes a very almost like silhouetted in reverse. It's difficult to understand the actual geometry of the tree, even from multiple photographs. Mm-hmm. So in a way, what we had was something that was essentially a two-dimensional profile of a three-dimensional object. And we had to triangulate a three-dimensionality from this two-dimensional profile. And that's one of the reasons why I did make different versions of the tree, and there was modifications, and some of it was about precision, but I recognize ultimately that the precision is not the end point here. It's not a facsimile. And I think that you just used a wonderful sentence to describe it, which is this idea of interrogating the Giacometti prop, that in some ways the physical manifestation that I made is an interrogation of the Giacometti. And actually, in a way, I think that works better because it's not an exact copy. I think it's the type of tension that might not be there if it was a perfect, exact facsimile.
And it's also a reinterpretation of the tree seen through a historical document, a photograph of the original stage setting. And I believe also that the fact when installing the tree at the Institute, I was struck by the fact that the light, which is maybe barely understandable in the photographs, and that I think the photographs poorly renders what it's actually in the stage. It stresses the status of the tree as being something for the stage, And also an exhibition is kind of staging. You light objects, you present them in a sort of way, and I'm sorry, I'm in eco. I'm trying to shed it.
It's okay, it's fine.
And yes,
thank you.
And what's interesting is I think that the light, also the blue and red. Maybe could you share for everyone the first image presentation, so that everyone can see what I'm talking about. If they
let me just get it organized here.
And while we do that, I'm asking, could you please switch off your microphones so that we don't get echo? And if you'd like to ask questions, you are very please invited to. Could you write them in the chat section? It's on the bar below the video. Thank you.
Is this the image you
yes.
want? Yeah.
So the green and green on the left and magenta or red on the right,
right.
Light actually, well, are there to evoke the moment of the scene. It's dawn, and what you can see on these photographs in the institute is the photograph you used for building the not replica but reinterpretation of the tree, and this moment is evoked also by a light on the background. This is the halo you can see on the background. But so what struck me was that the light stresses the very artificial nature of this presentation, so as the tree seems also very artificial compared to a sculpture. And I wondered if your intention was also to stress those aspects while building the tree, and maybe you could comment on this artificial nature of your installation, because I think that's also something we can feel and sense in the various works you presented as tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think your reading is very perceptive. I mean, I think it's funny because when I mean, I'm really appreciative of the way the foundation has worked with me in terms of presenting the tree, the Giacometti prop in this context, because it would be so easy for an institution to say, oh, well, we're just going to use like gallery lighting, or we're going to do something more conventional, and why do we need this theater lighting? And that would in a way be problematic in this context, I think, as you've perceived, because what's important about the tree is that it's not a sculpture. It doesn't exist in the gallery space as a sculpture. It shouldn't behave as a sculpture, and it shouldn't be addressed as a sculpture. It should be addressed as this kind of, you might say, a prop that's been recovered from history, right? That was disposed of and that somehow has been found again through this other process, through this process of refabrication. And so in that sense, actually, because it can never be a Giacometti, but what it can be is this kind of historical recovery process. And I think in that sense, actually, so it's important that it retains this status, as you say, of being sort of this conditional status, that it needs the lighting as part of it. It's part of what, that it doesn't exist just as an object, that it has to enter some other type of realm. And I think that idea of the historical, like the recovery of the prop, the historical recovery of the prop through the process of me remaking it, parallels a lot of the work that I've done in other areas, not using the same means necessarily, or even with the same ultimate effect, but that as an artist, the way that I find things interesting in the world and the way I act upon things in the world to develop projects often involves these types of trajectories, these types of ideas of working with the legacy of historical events, and often, very often, somehow things that are connected to visual art history. As I say, if it's American minimalist sculpture, or Giacometti, or Smithson, and usually sculpture for some reason. I don't know if I can explain that, but
there might be something to dig there. But also, am I correct in assessing or supposing that for you, this representation of 1961 of Godot with Giacometti bears some specific historical significance in the body of Beckett, of Godot's representations? Do you assign or relate this this staging of 1961 with Giacometti's tree to a historical moment, or is just one among others? Because
well, I think it's, of course, I mean, it has to be said that Waiting for Godot has a very celebrated history as a play, and I already talked about this idea of the type of theater that I'm interested in, these canonical works that have this ritual repetition. And of course, some of these repetitions become very celebrated and famous. I mean, with Godot, of course, there's, this is clearly one of the high points in the history of the play. Other high points, celebrated high points that I'm aware of, might be the productions that happened in the famous productions that happened in San Quentin prison in San Francisco in the US. There's many others, right? There's a whole history of the play itself, right? But I think that the other thing that I think is super interesting for me about about this particular reference point is that I think one of the things that always drew me to Godot was the fact that it was a sort of high point of a certain set of modernist ideas for me, artistic ideas, a kind of a cardinal point. And I think that that's only reinforced by that reaches a type of modernist kind of ideal in the connection. I keep looking over at the book here, which I have right beside me, and I look at this image as a kind of, as a trigger as I speak. But the idea of Beckett and Giacometti in the same space is, of course, really fascinating. And I think we spoke the other day about this image and about the fact that you have these two figures in the photograph and they're not looking at one another, and neither of them are looking at the camera either. And so there's this incredible sense of different planes, but also this sense of like a witness to history, but also this sense of a kind of theater in a way, and a tension within the image, and so they're all things that magnetically kind of draw me to the material. But as I said earlier, like towards the end of my presentation, I could summarize a little bit and say that I've always had this interest in this kind of modernist moment when there was this kind of appetite for transcending history. It's sort of a post-war moment, I think. And, historians will probably recognize that appetite for this kind of trans-historicism, we'll say, of high modernism is also about the legacy of the war, right? And escaping that, or moving away from that. And of course, I think an artist of my generation, and I recognize there's younger generations than mine who have different interests, but I think myself and other artists of my generation, I think, have been interested in that legacy of modernism precisely because it no longer feels, the ideas that those artists really worked upon seem so impossible now, and have been for a while.
So I'm seeing questions in the chat section. So I have a lot of questions to ask you, but maybe I shall ask just a few more, and then have the audience get into the questions. And one is related to the photographs you showed. That is the cover of the catalog, and I shall explain that this is a a photograph taken in 1961 when Beckett visited Giacometti in his studio while he was working on the tree. And as the person in the chat rightfully mentions, there was at some point, we don't know exactly if it's on the first visit, in the same visit, but at some point the painter Avigor Arica also visited the studio with Beckett and Giacometti. So I end this precision, but I shall come back to it. I would like just to know, you made in various interviews about your work, but I think this applies very well to this work, the distinction between reconstruction and reenactment, and that's also following up on what you're saying, I think, about the historical moment or some works that bear historical significance. Could you explain us how you distinguish reconstruction from reenactment, and why you rather choose, I think, the reconstruction over the reenactment?
Yeah, I suppose it was. I mean, that's a distinction that I made, kind of a hardline distinction that I made maybe 10 years ago in interviews. I'm probably a little bit more relaxed about it now, but I would to describe what I meant was I think that I was interested in the idea that I was interested in working with historical reference points, but I'm also with this very, very strong kind of awareness of the limitations of the methodologies that I could use for engaging with historical moments. And so the idea of enactment seemed to me to it seemed to evoke a sense of a kind of complete recovery or something. And whereas the idea of reconstruction for me seemed to be intrinsically artificial, because it seemed to be intrinsically synthetic, and seems to and have a sort of openness to it as a form. It's almost collage-like, I would say. And I suppose, to take up another theater reference, there's a Brechtian kind of ethos in that. There's a sense of that we cannot. There was a sense in that attitude that it's impossible to kind of re-inhabit a historical moment. That the best we can do is to work with the fragments that exist in our moment. And so so I mean, I talked earlier about this idea of like a trans-historical attitude from our appetite within kind of our atemporal almost attitude within high modernism, and I think that I'm very much working from a different position, which is a position that's very historically bounded, where we're stuck in the time that we're in. And we engage the historical moment through sort of increasingly fragmentary reference points. So that's kind of a way of answering your question, I hope, and also kind of rounding out some of the attitudes that might sort of inform the way I've thought about work. Yeah,
thank you. So, well, I have many questions, but just one last, and then we go with the audience. But I think what's also very interesting here is that we've got two great artists, Beckett and Giacometti, at work collaborating, and actually that's their sole collaboration. They did not collaborate for any other works, which is quite intriguing also. Why this play? Maybe because this shared solitude that Godot, the play is, had something to do with their own relationship. I'm just assuming. I'm not sure, but and I guess that's also maybe why you were interested in this specific staging. And you showed also that you were interested in the collaboration between Noguchi and Martha Graham. And so I was curious if you were interested in other representations by Beckett, other than Godot, other plays from Beckett. And also if you at some point looked at other great artists, great sculptures, because apparently there's something to do with sculpture, maybe in that sculptures are objects that, as the tree in the Godot's place, are quite ambiguous. They can be props and sculpture at the same time. Their status is not very defined, and that's something I think interesting. So have you looked at other sculptures such as Giacometti and Noguchi collaborating? For Giacometti, this is very rare, but other sculptures collaborating with dancers or with the arts of the stage, and how and why, maybe, and not the others.
Yeah, I mean, I showed a few examples, and as I said, Noguchi, Hepworth, who else? There's one or two others, but it's a minor history, I have to say. It's a history that's super interesting to me, and I did, as I said, it's about 10, 12, 15 years ago now when I really did that research. Getting an echo here again, but when I did the research, one of the things that was really interesting to me at the time was that there was very little published on this particular lineage. I mean, you would imagine with figures of the importance of Giacometti and Hepworth and Noguchi, that there'd be lots and lots of material published about their work in theater. But obviously in Giacometti's case in particular, there's not so much work in theater. I don't know if he ever made any other props. Maybe somebody from the Institute would know that. But Hepworth did have something of a history. She did do several productions, and Noguchi did a lot, as I said. I went back to Russian constructivism. I remember looking at like some work from the 20s. There's a strong history within Russian constructivism of artists working in theater. But otherwise, it's quite fragmentary. Somehow I was only interested in work up until, say, the late 60s, early 70s. The project I was engaged, that was kind of the parameter of my research at the time. Obviously, in more recent decades, there's a big history of it. But
okay, but it seems you were attracted to the sculptures because there's also a history of painters realizing stage designs for the stage. You can think about Diaghilev's ballets, how Picasso made Parade, Masson, Léger, they were very numerous. So apparently you are more attracted to sculptures, and at some point, constructivists, and also in the context of the Bauhaus, Schlemmer and etc. were making stage designs. It's also true for the futurists.
Absolutely. I mean, I was very aware of Schlemmer, for example, and it's a great question, and what I can say as an answer is that, and this is going to sound like a slightly strange jump, but I think that my specific interest in sculpture in this context goes back to this text that I referenced, this this essay by Michael Fried, this famous essay about minimalist art called Art and Objecthood. So the Fried wrote the essay in 1967, I think. It was published in Art Forum, and it was a hard critique of minimalist art. He wasn't a fan. He was a modernist, a Greenbergian. But I was very interested in the argument that he formulated around this relationship between, he essentially, I'm not sure how familiar people in our audience today are familiar with this essay. Some people may be super familiar with it. It's quite famous within the field, but others may not be familiar at all. So I don't want to take things for granted, but I would say, like, this very simple characterization of the essay is that he objected to minimalist art because he felt that it was art that had become theater.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most simple sort of description of it. That he felt that it had crossed the threshold in art, and it had entered the realm of theater. And I was interested in that threshold that he identified. I was interested in this, what it was to cross that threshold. And I think that was a preoccupation of mine throughout many works of mine. I could thread that through almost everything I've made in the last 20 odd years. And I think that, in a way, actually, that preoccupation was what I took backwards to Giacometti and Beckett, almost. In fact, they're not so far apart. We're talking about a Giacometti Beckett production from 1961, and a Fried text that's actually only from 6 years later, even though it feels like it's sort of from a different period. But they're almost from the same time, from our perspective. But my interest in that argument that Fried formulated in that text, as I said, it's become a prism through which I've looked at a lot of other material, and the Beckett Giacometti relationship was definitely, has been informed by that prism, so to speak.